Hi, Aaron.
And Ting.
Hinting.
And everyone else who's watching this.
This is Luke and
Nicole, and the title of our study is Packaging Reuse and Internalizing Sustainable Behaviors. So looking at our communication triangle for how we got to this research topic, the primary thing we were looking to test is whether people are more likely to exhibit sustainable packaging reuse behaviors if it's due to some internal reasoning. This was kind of like the main theme we came up with. And some examples that we wanted to pull from the world are, for example, kids see the potential in everyday materials and use them creatively, like cardboard forts. So that's kind of a contrast to one counter argument, which could be that no one pays attention to packaging. Another example is that people in low resource environments redirect waste through thrift, for example, using food containers for storage after the primary use is complete. And that's also kind of in contrast to a general preference to brand name storage like Ziploc and Tupperware with known quality and status. And then finally, the example that we would want to run through our experiment is that people who are presented with clearly reusable packaging alternatives, we hope will internalize sustainable decision making, which is what this study was focused on.
Okay, so we did get there through a slight evolution. Going into this whole project, Nicole's and my goal was to try to determine how to increase the sustainability of e-commerce packaging, so just tackling, big bad Amazon and their systems by discovering methods to encourage upcycling of packaging materials. As for what upcycling is, we sort of took a little bit of inspiration from a TED Talk. I've got a link in the bottom of the slide here, given by Andrew Dent, who I think is like a materials scientist, has a pretty interesting materials science firm devoted to helping designers. Anyway, he came out with a TED Talk just kind of going into a discussion of how future products need to incorporate ideas of thrift into their designs from the get-go. So from that inspiration and our goal, we developed a couple initial hypotheses that are similar to what Nicole just stated. Packaging designed to be repurposed will be seen as more sustainable than packaging designed to be recycled. And similarly, people would repurpose packaging if it were a clear house. That's kind of the thrifting behavior. So we started through a kind of a brainstorm to try to figure out what packaging like this would look like, and then we came onto this concept of Ziploc bags inflated and kind of stuck together in a chain to mimic the appearance and functionality of packaging pillows. And being all excited with the idea that we thought we may have just nailed it on, we kind of focused our experiment on checking to see if this idea was actually valid. So that's when we met with Aaron and kind of talked about the idea of centering our experiment around the search for a spillover effect. So our goal stayed fairly similar. Hypothesis evolved into what Nicole just spoke about. So ultimately we were testing for a spillover effect to see if our Ziploc bag concept can subconsciously encourage sustainable behaviors, and if so, it may be able to encourage its own reuse, and be kind of a valid product concept idea at the same time.
Here are some of the figures that we would use if we were to turn this into a paper. So here's an example, a diagram showing what this packaging is that we designed. So you can see how the Ziploc bags are attached with a perforated seam along the bottom seal, and they still maintain resealable bag closure and have kind of like a safety mechanism just so that you still feel like it's the first time you're using a bag, just to ensure cleanliness.
So for our actual study, participants received a cardboard box containing a selection of snacks, and they were asked to sort them. If you follow those top arrows, this is kind of our control case where just a standard box of new in-box Ziploc bags was presented to the participants along with the snacks, and they were asked to go through the sorting exercise with those bags. If you follow the bottom arrows, this is our test case. Participants were given the same task of sorting snacks, but instead the bags that they had available to them were our kind of reusable packaging bags. That was the only difference. After that, all participants filled out an identical survey to kind of gauge their interaction with the experiment and their past experiences with recycling and sustainability practices in general.
These are the survey questions that they were then asked to fill out. They mainly followed experiment debriefing, just wondering if they had any inclinations about what the experiment was about, some observations about the snacks themselves and the storage used for the food packaging, as well as what they were using for sorting. Then asking about habits around food, reuse, general opinions around packaging, and how other family members may use containers in creative ways, and then some demographic information.
Okay, so we collected a good amount of data from both this survey and our experiment. This slide is all about data collected purely from the experiment. Our dependent variable that we were looking for was the number of organic snacks versus non-organic snacks that our participants were sorting into bags. So the total numbers for standard and double use indicate the total numbers of bags that were filled with snacks. To get this number, we treated a bag that only contained organic snacks as being 100% organic. Typically people blended snacks per bag, so if they had 4 different types of snacks in a given bag, each one was assigned just 25% of the total bag contents. We figured that any resolution higher than that was not really attainable and didn't really matter because people were just kind of grabbing a handful and getting on with it. So we ran a couple ANOVA tests to determine any correlation between the data sets of folks sorting with standard bags versus double-use bags for each snack type. And the data for those you can see in the far right column.
Here's a graph representation of that same data, so you can see that the people offered standard bags versus double-use bags. There wasn't a huge difference in terms of the types of snacks that they selected, non-organic versus organic.
Okay, and this is another kind of way of visualizing our data. This brought in one of our survey questions. I believe it was question number 8 there. So how likely are you to shop for organic food on a regular basis? It's submitted on a 7-point Likert scale. And we made an assumption that that value represents our participants' like typical habits. So the response they gave for that question is sort of like the left-hand side of the starting point for each of the colored lines in these plots. And we sort of, the idea is that the experiment is kind of in the middle there, and then off to the right is the results from their experiment, so it's the observed preference. When we talk about preference here, it is organic over non-organic, so the likelihood of choosing organic instead of non. And it kind of looks like you'll see some convergence here where people seem to indicate a wide spread of whether or not they're going to choose organic, and everyone sort of ends up a little bit more in the middle as we are in the process of conducting the experiment. So we did an ANOVA study on that set of data as well, and similarly to just the sheer quantity of snacks per bag study we did previously, those ANOVA tests revealed no statistically significant difference between data sets. And in kind of a crazy instance, in fact, when comparing the number of snack bags filled in the control case versus the test case, so that was pertaining to this data, the ANOVA results were literally identical, which is pretty crazy that happened. So anyway, it's unlikely from this data that our experiment and our Ziploc bag packaging pillow concept, together at least, produced any change in user behaviors as they pertain to organic versus non-organic food selection.
We brainstormed some reasons why we may not have seen the expected spillover effect. One of the big ones we think is that we were making the assumption that people would associate organic with being environmentally friendly and or sustainable. And so if that link wasn't there, that would already break the logic chain needed for this to happen. And we think also that because the study was people sorting foods, naturally their preferences with regard to that, which are generally pretty strong, would have come forward and maybe been even stronger than any sort of inclination towards sustainable behavior that we could have otherwise seen.
Mm-hmm. And we were both present during all the experimental run-througs, gave review a couple, and we made sure to just collect information on what each participant said during the process, and the number of people who were kind of revolting against even the idea of an organic label was quite high. And even with snacks that we tried to make kind of benign and similar, people still had very strong preferences over type of. We ended up settling on using raisins and kind of like plain Jane corn tortilla chips, and we even found users who straight up disliked corn tortilla chips, and as a result went entirely for raisins. And the same user was totally nonplussed by the organic label. So we just had those kinds of reactions all over the place.
In the future, we think some modifications to this experiment to continue to try to look for some sort of a spillover effect with packaging could be around maybe having identical foods, and instead of using organic as an indicator of sustainability, we could use locally sourced, which may have a more positive reception to people, where kind of it's more universally accepted as being sustainable and also worthwhile. And then another alternative could be just a different type of sorting task that doesn't involve food, in order to remove that as a big personal preference, which skewed the results. And that's it!
Thanks a lot for all your help. We were excited by the concept. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but we're not giving up yet, I don't believe.
Those packaging pillows will make it to the real world.
Patent pending, don't even try. We know where you work.